In the final hour before midnight, a quiet English house prepares for celebration unaware that time itself is about to betray a secret. Miss Marple listens, watches, and waits as the old year closes, knowing that some endings arrive not with bells, but with truth in silence and careful observation. Chapter 1. The quiet house before midnight. The last hour of the year arrived without haste, as though time itself wished to be polite. Outside, the village lanes lay silvered with frost, and the hedgerows wore a thin veil of white that caught the moonlight like lace. The air had that particular stillness that belonged to winter nights in the countryside, when even distant sounds seemed softened, as if wrapped in wool. A faint scent of coal smoke drifted from chimneys and settled low in the dark, and the sky held its stars with a clean and steady clarity. Ravenhurst House stood a little above the village, not grand in the theatrical sense, but dignified in its quiet confidence. Its windows glowed with warm yellow light, each pane a small promise of shelter. A wreath hung on the front door, understated, trimmed with pine and ribbon, and a single lantern by the steps cast a calm circle over the stone. Inside, the house was prepared for a modest New Year gathering, the kind that wore elegance like a well-kept secret, rather than a display. In the main drawing room, the fire had been built properly, with seasoned logs that burned evenly and without fuss. The flames moved with a gentle patience, throwing soft shadows over framed portraits and polished surfaces. A gramophone in the corner played something slow and refined, music that did not demand attention but offered comfort, like a familiar voice in a quiet room. On a sideboard, a tray of glasses stood ready, and beside it a bowl of oranges and nuts created a small, old-fashioned celebration of abundance. Miss Marple sat slightly apart, as she often did, in a high-backed chair placed near enough to the fire for warmth, but not so close that it became the center of her attention. She wore a simple coat in a muted shade, the kind that suited her and allowed others to forget her presence until it was too late to do so. Her hands rested in her lap, and her eyes moved with quiet purpose, taking in details with the calm devotion of someone who loved patterns more than people realized. There were 7 guests besides herself, and each seemed to carry their own version of the evening. Some carried it like a gift. Some carried it like a duty. The host, Mr. Alistair Weatherby, was a man of tidy habits and carefully managed expressions. His hair was brushed back, his cuffs precise, and his manner possessed the steady courtesy of someone who believed politeness could keep the world in order. He moved from guest to guest with a glass in hand, speaking in a voice that never rose or fell too far from the middle. Near the window stood Mrs. Evelyn Hart, a woman dressed in dark velvet with pearls that caught the firelight. Her smile appeared at suitable moments, yet her eyes remained watchful, as though the room contained a question she could not afford to answer. She held her glass with the gentle certainty of someone who had attended many gatherings and understood the unspoken rules of them. Across from her, leaning slightly against the mantel, Dr. Lionel Graves spoke in low tones to a younger man named Peter Ashford. Dr. Graves had the air of a physician who had learned to appear calm even when he was not. His voice was measured, and his hands were composed. But Miss Marple noticed that he adjusted his cuff twice within a minute, each adjustment small, each one unnecessary. Peter Ashford, by contrast, carried a restless energy. He smiled readily, nodded often, and glanced toward the hall as if expecting someone else to enter. At a small table near the bookshelf, Miss Cora Finch arranged and rearranged a set of folded napkins, though there was no practical reason to do so. She was unmarried, well-dressed, and always slightly too eager to be useful. Her usefulness, Miss Marple suspected, was her way of staying safe. People forgave those who served them. People overlooked those who kept their hands busy. In an armchair close to the fire sat Major Rowan Slate. Retired, broad-shouldered, with a calm face shaped by discipline. He spoke little, but when he did, others listened. There was a steadiness to him that could either soothe a room or tighten it, depending on what he chose to say. At the moment, he chose silence, and the silence seemed to gather around him as if it belonged there. The final guest, Mrs. Judith Lane, arrived late, as though lateness were a statement rather than an accident. She entered with a light laugh and a faint trace of cold air, and her coat carried the scent of winter. Her hair was carefully done, and her lipstick was a shade too bright for the subtle palette of Ravenhurst House. She looked at the room the way an actress might look at a stage, taking in where everyone stood, and how the scene could be shaped. Mr. Weatherby greeted her with courtesy. The greeting held just enough warmth to appear sincere, and just enough distance to suggest history. Miss Marple watched that distance closely. She had seen it before, in village disputes and family dinners, in church committees and charity bazaars. Distance could be a boundary. It could also be evidence. The room settled again into gentle conversation. New Year was mentioned in polite phrases. Resolutions were joked about without anyone risking sincerity. Someone spoke of weather, and someone else replied about roads and frost. It was an ordinary kind of talk, the sort that existed to prevent the awkwardness of truth. Yet Miss Marple felt the air of the room the way some people felt a change in temperature. There was a tension beneath the politeness, a subtle narrowing, as if the house itself were holding its breath. She watched the clock on the mantel, a handsome object with a simple face and Roman numerals. It ticked with steady confidence. Each tick sounded reasonable, almost comforting. And yet, she noticed something peculiar. The minute hand was just slightly misaligned. Not enough for most eyes to care. But Miss Marple cared. She cared because she had lived long enough to understand that small errors were often chosen rather than accidental. She leaned forward, only a fraction, letting her eyes settle on the clock's face, as though she were admiring it. Mr. Weatherby's gaze followed hers for a moment. It was brief, but it happened. He looked at the clock the way a man checked a lock twice. Then he turned away, smoothing his jacket, and said something about the champagne being properly chilled. Miss Marple did not smile. She simply accepted the observation and stored it away. A servant passed through the room with a tray of small pastries. Miss Cora Finch reached for one, then hesitated, then took it anyway. Her fingers trembled almost invisibly. Mrs. Evelyn Hart laughed at something Peter Ashford said, but the laugh ended too quickly, like a candle being pinched out. On the sideboard, the champagne bottles waited. A silver tray held folded napkins, and beside it lay a small black notebook, closed, its cover worn. It did not belong among the celebratory objects. Miss Marple saw it and wondered why it had been left there. It looked like the sort of notebook that contained reminders, addresses, sums of money, lists of duties, lists of wrongs. At 9 minutes to midnight, Mr. Weatherby announced that they would soon move into the dining room for a final toast. His voice was smooth, but the word final carried a weight he did not intend to reveal. Miss Marple watched him as he spoke. He kept his hands still. He kept his face composed, yet his jaw tightened briefly at the end of the sentence, as though he had bitten down on something sharp. They began to rise and gather themselves, moving in polite patterns toward the hall. Miss Marple took her time. She always did. It allowed her to notice what others missed in their hurry to appear natural. As the guests drifted toward the dining room, she saw Mrs. Judith Lane pause near the sideboard and glance down at the black notebook. She did not touch it, but her eyes lingered on it with the intensity of recognition. Then Mrs. Lane looked up and met Miss Marple's gaze. It was only a second. Only a glance, but in that second, something passed between them that was not friendliness. It was the silent awareness of two people recognizing a shape in the dark. Mrs. Lane smiled, faint and careful, then turned away and followed the others. Miss Marple rose at last, walking slowly, her steps quiet on the polished floor. She passed the sideboard and glanced at the notebook herself. It was a simple thing, unremarkable, except for the way it did not belong. She did not open it. She did not need to. She simply confirmed that it was real, and that it was being noticed by others. In the hall, a tall mirror reflected the guests as they moved, their figures doubled in glass, their expressions softened by reflection. Miss Marple watched those reflections too. Sometimes a person's face in a mirror told a truth they did not show directly. They entered the dining room, where the table had been set with restrained elegance. Candles flickered gently, their flames steady, as if the air were too still to disturb them. Plates and cutlery shone. A small arrangement of evergreen and white flowers sat in the center, simple, winter-like, and tasteful. The clock in the dining room was smaller, but equally prominent. It chimed softly at the quarter hour, a polite reminder that time was moving. The guests took their seats, guided by habit and subtle social decisions. Miss Marple noticed who sat beside whom, and who avoided whom. Mrs. Hart sat with a careful space between herself and Dr. Graves. Peter Ashford chose a place where he could see the door. Major Slate sat at the far end, his posture straight, his hands resting calmly on the table. Mr. Weatherby lifted his glass, and the others followed. Candlelight made the champagne glow pale gold. He began to speak. He spoke of the year ending, of gratitude, of friendship. Each word sounded correct. Each phrase was the kind that belonged to evenings like this. Yet Miss Marple listened for what he did not say. She listened for the slight pauses. She listened for the moment when his voice caught, and when he reached the final sentence, the one meant to carry them into midnight, his gaze flicked again toward the clock. Miss Marple saw it clearly now. The clock mattered. The last hour mattered. The ending mattered more than the beginning. Outside, far off in the village, a church bell began to toll the first note of the final countdown. It sounded distant, gentle, almost tender. Inside Ravenhurst House, everyone lifted their glasses. And Miss Marple, with her calm and patient gaze, understood something that no one else had yet allowed themselves to admit. This was not merely a gathering to welcome the new year. This was a gathering arranged to survive it. The last minutes before midnight often made people kinder than they truly were. They softened their voices, lifted their glasses, and spoke of new beginnings, as though beginnings were guaranteed. Ravenhurst House wore that same illusion for a moment, its candlelight warm, its table polished, its guests arranged like figures in a carefully staged scene. Yet the calm was fragile. It felt less like peace and more like a pause. Mr. Weatherby's toast ended with a modest smile. Glasses clinked gently. A few murmurs of approval passed around the table. Miss Cora Finch offered a polite little laugh that sounded more like relief than amusement. Mrs. Evelyn Hart took a sip of champagne with a slight tremor in her hand, then set her glass down as if she feared dropping it. Dr. Graves looked at the bubbles rising in his glass, with the absorbed focus of a man trying to occupy his mind with something harmless. Major Slate said nothing at all, though his eyes moved from face to face with a soldier's careful habit of reading a room. Miss Marple watched the way the guests behaved once the toast was over. The toast itself was a performance. What happened afterward was always more truthful. The talk returned, low and controlled, and drifted toward harmless topics. Someone mentioned fireworks in London. Someone else replied about crowded streets and cold hands. Peter Ashford said something cheerful about the next year being better than the last. Mrs. Judith Lane replied with a bright remark about optimism being necessary, her smile flashing briefly, too bright, then fading again. Miss Marple noticed that no one mentioned the past year. Not directly. It sat among them like an uninvited guest. People spoke around it, They built careful sentences that avoided certain names, certain months, certain events. At 5 minutes to midnight, Mr. Weatherby suggested they move back into the drawing room, where the larger clock could be seen and heard. His suggestion was framed as comfort, yet there was that same subtle tightness behind it. A need to control the scene. Chairs moved softly across the floor. Napkins were folded, unnecessary, and placed neatly. Miss Cora Finch hurried to assist, though no one asked. Dr. Graves offered his arm to Mrs. Hart, and she accepted with a grace that seemed almost automatic. They filed into the drawing room again, returning to the fire and the gramophone and the quiet glow of lamps. The room had not changed, yet Miss Marple felt the air shift as they entered. The clock on the mantel seemed louder now, each tick clear enough to count. Mr. Weatherby stood near the mantel, glass in hand, as if he were the guardian of time itself. Peter Ashford took up a position near the doorway again, pretending to admire a painting while clearly watching the hall. Mrs. Judith Lane moved toward the window and looked out into the night, though there was little to see besides frost and darkness. Mrs. Hart sat, then stood again, as if her body could not decide whether it should rest or flee. Miss Marple remained near her chair, allowing others to circle the room in uneasy orbits. She listened with the patient focus of someone who had spent her life hearing what was not being said. She heard the nervous brightness of Peter Ashford's voice. She heard the carefully measured calm of Dr. Graves. She heard the slight edge beneath Mrs. Judith Lane's charm. She heard the silence of Major Slate as clearly as she heard the ticking of the clock. Then, something small happened. It would not have been noticed by most. It was not a loud sound. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was merely Mr. Weatherby reaching toward the mantel, as if to adjust a candle or straighten a small ornament. His fingers touched the base of the clock, and the clock shifted almost imperceptibly, a fraction of an inch. Miss Marple saw it. Not only saw it, but understood the purpose in the motion. The clock had been positioned deliberately, perhaps to hide something behind it, perhaps to align it with something, perhaps simply to reassure its owner that it remained exactly as intended. Mr. Weatherby withdrew his hand and turned, offering a polite comment about how quickly the year had passed. Miss Marple's gaze went to the mantel. Behind the clock, a thin shadow did not fall quite naturally. A small slip of paper might have been pressed there, or a key, or something else that could be hidden quickly, something meant to remain unnoticed until needed. She did not approach. Not yet. She simply held the detail in her mind, as one might hold a thread, waiting to see where it led. Outside, distant bells began their slow count. The village church did not ring with excitement. It rang with steadiness, a measured marking of time. 10, 9, 8. The sound traveled through cold air and reached the windows with a faint, softened tone. The guests began to gather closer, drawn by habit and by the strange power of shared ritual. People liked to be together when time turned, even if they did not truly like each other. 7, 6. Miss Marple watched faces. Mrs. Hart's smile tightened. Dr. Graves swallowed once, his throat moving visibly. Peter Ashford's eyes darted to the hall, then to the clock, then away again. Miss Cora Finch clasped her hands together so tightly her knuckles whitened. 5, 4. Mrs. Judith Lane turned away from the window and stepped toward the group. She held her glass slightly higher now, as if she wished to appear more enthusiastic than she felt. Her eyes met Mr. Weatherby's for a moment, and Miss Marple saw something there that had nothing to do with celebration. It was an old understanding, an old threat, or an old promise. 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year was said in soft voices. Glasses clinked again. A few gentle laughs rose and fell. Someone kissed someone's cheek politely. The gramophone, as if sensing the ritual, reached the end of a record and fell into a brief hush before the next record could be set. And in that hush, another sound arrived. A small sound, almost delicate. It came from the hall, beyond the drawing room. A faint scrape, like a shoe catching on wood, or a chair moved softly, or a door touched and released. It was the kind of sound that could be dismissed as the house settling, the kind of sound a polite mind would explain away. But Miss Marple did not explain it away. She watched Peter Ashford's head turn sharply toward the doorway. He tried to hide it, tried to smooth it into a casual glance, but the instinct was too quick. Dr. Graves froze for a fraction of a second, his glass suspended. Mrs. Hart's face drained of color, and she set her glass down with care, as if she suddenly needed both hands free. Mr. Weatherby spoke immediately, too quickly, a cheerful remark about the bell sounding especially clear this year. His voice was warm, his smile practiced, his tone a touch too loud for the quiet room. Major Slate did not move, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Miss Marple stayed still. She did not rush to the hall. She did not ask a question. She simply allowed the moment to reveal what it wanted to reveal. The house was quiet again, but the quiet was different now. It was no longer the gentle quiet of winter. It was the deliberate quiet of people listening for what might come next. Mrs. Judith Lane broke the tension with a soft laugh and a comment about how old houses always creaked at midnight, as if they were announcing themselves. Her laugh sounded bright, but Miss Marple noticed that her fingers tightened around her glass. Mr. Weatherby agreed at once. He added a remark about the age of the timber, the settling of foundations. He spoke as though he were giving a reassuring lecture. Yet his eyes flicked to the hall again, and his smile tightened as if it were held in place by effort. Miss Marple rose slowly. It was not a dramatic movement. It was simply a natural decision, made calmly, the way an elderly woman might rise to fetch a shawl or to excuse herself. She walked toward the doorway with gentle steps. Her posture was relaxed, almost casual. No one could accuse her of suspicion because she did not look suspicious. She looked like Miss Marple. And Miss Marple was often underestimated because she looked like someone who belonged in the background of life. As she reached the doorway, she paused and let her gaze move down the corridor. The hall was dimmer than the drawing room, lit by a single lamp on a small table. Shadows rested in corners. The staircase rose quietly to the upper floor, its banister polished by years of hands. Nothing moved. Yet Miss Marple sensed movement had happened here very recently. Not the movement of the house, but the movement of a person. The air carried it in subtle ways, the faint disturbance of stillness, the sense of a presence that had slipped away. She turned her head slightly and looked at the small table by the lamp. On it lay a pair of gloves, neatly placed. Beside them, a small object that had not been there earlier. A narrow silver key, thin and old, the kind that belonged to a desk drawer or a small locked box. Miss Marple did not touch it. She simply looked at it, letting the image fix itself in her mind with clarity. A key appeared at midnight. A sound in the hall. A clock that had been adjusted with care. A notebook left on a sideboard like a warning. Behind her, the voices in the drawing room continued, forced laughter trying to return the evening to normal. Yet the laughter did not quite fill the space. It remained thin, like fabric stretched too far. Miss Marple turned back toward the room. Her face held calm, but her eyes were quietly sharper now. She understood something else as well. Something that settled into place with the certainty of experience. The new year had begun, and Ravenhurst House had already started to hide something within its first minute. The last hour of the old year was over, but its intention remained, lingering like smoke in still air, and Miss Marple, patient and unhurried, knew she had just been shown the first true clue. Not in words, not in confession, but in the careful, frightened choreography of people who believed time itself could protect them. Chapter 2. The Celebration That Feels Rehearsed. The first minutes of the new year should have brought release. In most houses, the turning of midnight loosened people's shoulders and softened their faces. They laughed more freely, spoke more honestly, and allowed the old year to drift away like a curtain falling at the end of a performance. But inside Ravenhurst House, the air remained carefully held, as if the guests did not trust the new year to behave. The drawing room returned to its gentle noises. The gramophone was set again, a quieter piece this time, strings that moved like slow water. The fire continued its steady work, warm but not dramatic. Glasses were refilled, though fewer sips were taken. Smiles were offered, though most of them arrived half a second late, as if their owners had to remember to wear them. Miss Marple remained near the doorway, her posture unhurried, her expression mild. She had returned from the hall without announcing what she had seen. The silver key still sat on the small table by the lamp, untouched. And it was this untouched state that mattered. If someone had meant it to be found, they would have wanted it noticed quickly. If someone had meant it to remain hidden, they would have retrieved it at once. Yet it remained, as if the person who placed it there did not dare return for it. Mr. Weatherby stood by the mantel, maintaining his role as host, speaking to whoever drifted near him. He had the controlled friendliness of a man determined to keep an evening intact, even if the evening wished to break apart. His eyes moved often toward the hall, though he tried to mask this by adjusting the placement of a glass or straightening a small ornament. Mrs. Evelyn Hart took a seat again, but she chose a chair that placed her closer to the window, as if she felt safer, with a view of the outside darkness. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced tightly. She nodded at remarks she did not truly hear. Her gaze kept sliding toward Dr. Graves, then away, as though looking at him too long might summon something she could not control. Dr. Graves attempted conversation, the kind of steady professional tone that suggested he believed calm words could sedate any situation. He made a comment about village bells being a comforting tradition. He spoke about how New Year was often a psychological turning point for people. Yet as he spoke, his eyes did not settle. They kept moving, searching the room for reactions rather than admiring it. Peter Ashford, restless, moved closer to the doorway where Miss Marple stood. He did not speak to her directly at first. Instead, he pretended to admire a painting hung near the hall. It was a winter landscape, a pale path cutting through frost-covered trees. His gaze flicked to the corridor, then back to the painting, then to the corridor again. He looked like a man trying to convince himself nothing had happened. Miss Cora Finch, as if sensing that conversation alone could not hold the room together, hurried to the sideboard to offer more champagne and small cakes. Her movements were efficient, almost too efficient, as though she had rehearsed this kind of helpfulness many times. She asked politely whether anyone would like more, and when people replied no, she still rearranged the tray, as if it were vital to do so. Major Slate remained near the fire, a solid presence that made the room feel less fragile. He watched with the quiet authority of someone who had seen panic before and learned not to feed it. He did not interrupt. He did not press. He simply observed, and his silence seemed to make everyone else's words sound thinner. Mrs. Judith Lane moved among the group with a bright calm that felt carefully applied. She spoke to Mr. Weatherby about the beauty of old houses, about how time gave them character. She complimented Miss Cora Finch on the arrangement of the tray. She laughed lightly at something Peter Ashford said, though the laugh did not reach her eyes. She was performing reassurance, and she performed it well. Miss Marple watched the performance and recognized its shape. In village life, there were always moments when a community behaved as though it were acting for itself, speaking in the right tones to prevent something unpleasant from becoming real. People believed that if they played the part of calm long enough, the danger might lose interest and go away. But danger did not go away simply because someone smiled. Miss Marple stepped forward slightly, not drawing attention, simply joining the flow of people. Her gentle voice did not cut through the room. It slipped into it. "How lovely it is," she said softly, "to begin the year in such a peaceful place." It was a harmless remark, but harmless remarks were often the best kind, because they allowed others to respond without suspicion. Mr. Weatherby turned toward her quickly, too quickly, and agreed with a warmth that felt forced. He spoke about the comfort of tradition, the goodness of familiar faces. His words were smooth, but Miss Marple noticed how he avoided looking at the small table in the hall. Mrs. Hart murmured something polite about the village being charming. Dr. Graves nodded and spoke about the restorative nature of quiet countryside air. Peter Ashford smiled and said he had always believed old houses were safest, because nothing truly surprised them. Miss Marple let that sentence settle. Safest, old houses. Nothing surprised them. Then she looked toward the hall, her eyes drifting naturally, as if she were simply considering the architecture. "It is rather curious," she said, still in that mild tone, "how houses do seem to have their own little habits. A creak here, a draught there. One feels as if they remember things." The remark was still harmless, but it contained a subtle hook. Miss Marple saw it catch. Mrs. Hart's fingers tightened in her lap. Dr. Graves blinked once, slowly. Peter Ashford's smile faltered, and then returned. Mrs. Judith Lane's eyes narrowed by a fraction, then smoothed again into charm. Mr. Weatherby laughed politely and said houses remembered nothing. Only people did. Yet his laughter was too light. It sounded like paper. Miss Marple nodded, as if she agreed completely. She did not challenge him. She never rushed a thing. She drifted toward the sideboard, where the black notebook still rested among the celebratory items, like a stain on linen. Miss Cora Finch noticed her interest and hurried to stand nearby, ready to explain, ready to serve, ready to protect herself by being useful. "Oh, that is Mr. Weatherby's little book," Miss Finch said quickly, her voice too eager. "He writes down reminders. Lists. Very organized, you know." Miss Marple smiled gently. "How sensible. I suppose one must be organized when one has a house like this." Miss Finch nodded. Her eyes moved toward the hall as she spoke, and then back again. She seemed to realize she had done it, and tried to hide that realization by straightening a napkin. Miss Marple looked down at the notebook without touching it. "Lists can be very helpful," she said, as if speaking of groceries. "Sometimes they can be very revealing too, can they not?" Miss Finch gave a small laugh that sounded like a cough. "Oh yes, well. It's just ordinary things. Ordinary." Ordinary was always the word people used when something was not ordinary at all. Miss Marple let her gaze drift to the silver key in the hall, visible now from where she stood, lying on the small table by the lamp. It caught the lamplight faintly, like a quiet signal. She did not point at it. She did not ask about it. She simply allowed her eyes to rest on it for the length of a breath. Then she looked away again, turning back toward the guests. There were subtle movements in response. Peter Ashford shifted his weight. Dr. Graves cleared his throat. Mrs. Hart's hand rose to her necklace, and then fell again. Mrs. Judith Lane's smile tightened. Only Major Slate remained unchanged. Miss Marple returned to her chair, moving slowly, her steps quiet. She sat with her hands folded and listened to the conversation as it tried to find safe ground again. The group began speaking of resolutions and travel plans, of London and weather and small pleasant things. Yet the room did not relax. The words were the wrapping paper. The tension was the gift inside. Miss Marple's mind, calm and patient, began arranging the details she had gathered like pieces of lace being pinned into a pattern. The clock had been adjusted. A sound had come from the hall at midnight. A silver key had appeared. The notebook sat in plain sight. Several guests reacted to the mention of house habits, as if habit were a threat. Mr. Weatherby guarded the mantle as though it contained something more valuable than a clock. She waited. And as she waited, the rehearsed nature of the evening revealed itself further. At 12:15, Mr. Weatherby announced that he would bring out a special New Year tradition. His smile widened slightly, and the guests responded with polite interest. Yet Miss Marple noticed that the announcement had the air of a planned distraction. He went to the sideboard, lifted a small wooden box, and carried it to the center table. "This," he said, "is something of a family custom. A New Year memory box. Everyone writes a wish, or a thought, and we seal it until next year." He opened the box, revealing slips of paper and a pencil. The guests smiled and murmured approval. They took slips, they wrote, they folded, but as they did, Miss Marple watched their hands. Some wrote quickly, without thinking. Some hesitated, as if writing anything felt dangerous. Mrs. Hart's pen paused in mid-air for several seconds. Dr. Graves wrote with firm strokes, too firm. Peter Ashford wrote something short, then crumpled the paper and started again. Mrs. Judith Lane wrote with graceful ease, as though words were always her allies. Miss Marple took her own slip and wrote a simple, harmless sentence. She folded it neatly. Then, as each guest dropped their folded wish into the box, Miss Marple noticed something peculiar. Mr. Weatherby watched the slips fall in with a kind of concentration that had nothing to do with sentiment. His gaze lingered on hands, on paper, on the way each person folded. He was not collecting wishes. He was collecting something else. A ritual could be used as a mask. A ritual could be used to confirm loyalty. A ritual could be used to distract. Miss Marple's eyes moved again to the hall table, to the silver key that still lay there. A key, a box, a clock, and a house filled with people performing calm while time itself watched them. The new year had begun. But inside Ravenhurst House, the old year's secret still breathed. And Miss Marple, quietly, gently, understood that the celebration was not meant to welcome the future. It was meant to bury the past. After the memory box was sealed, the guests applauded softly, as if applause could persuade the night to behave. Mr. Weatherby placed the wooden box back on the sideboard with careful precision. The pencil was returned to its spot. The box sat there like a small monument to sentiment, yet Miss Marple sensed that its true purpose was not sentiment at all. The room continued to speak in gentle tones. The gramophone played on. The fire remained steady. But the house itself seemed to listen. Miss Marple watched the silver key again. It had now existed in the open for long enough to become strange. If it belonged to the house, someone would have picked it up and said, "How careless." If it belonged to a guest, someone would have claimed it. Yet it lay untouched, as if everyone had silently agreed to pretend it was not there. Miss Marple had seen this sort of agreement before. It was the kind made without words, the kind made in glances and pauses. People made such agreements when acknowledging something would force them to confront what it meant. She did not confront it directly. Instead, she created a moment where the key could be spoken of naturally. She rose slowly again, with the quiet steadiness of age, and walked toward the hall as if she had simply remembered something. Miss Cora Finch immediately stood as well, eager to assist, eager to attach herself to a harmless task. Miss Finch followed at a respectful distance, her shoes making the faintest sound on the polished floor. Miss Marple paused at the small table by the lamp, letting her gaze rest on the key as though she had only just noticed it. "Oh dear," she said gently, with mild surprise. "Someone has dropped a key." The words floated into the drawing room without accusation. They were the sort of words any elderly lady might say, kind and practical. Yet their effect was immediate. Peter Ashford's voice stopped mid-sentence. Dr. Graves fell silent. Mrs. Hart's glass trembled slightly as she set it down. Mr. Weatherby's head turned with a quickness he could not hide. Mrs. Judith Lane's smile remained, but it became thinner. Major Slate, by contrast, merely watched, his expression unchanged. Miss Cora Finch stepped forward, eyes wide. "Oh, I hadn't noticed," she said quickly. Too quickly. "How strange." Miss Marple picked up the key with gentle care, holding it between her thumb and forefinger. It was narrow, old, and slightly tarnished. The kind of key that did not belong to a modern lock. It felt like something from a desk drawer, a small cabinet, perhaps a box. She held it up slightly, not dramatically, simply enough to show it. "Does anyone recognize it?" Silence answered first. Then Mr. Weatherby laughed lightly. "Oh, that could be anything. Old houses have keys everywhere. It's probably been there for years." Miss Marple looked at him with mild curiosity. How curious that it should appear just now, then. Mr. Weatherby's smile stiffened. Perhaps it fell from a pocket. Or from a tray. Miss Marple nodded slowly, as if considering this. She turned toward Miss Cora Finch. "Did you bring any keys in with the refreshments, my dear?" Miss Finch shook her head quickly. No, certainly not." Miss Marple turned toward Peter Ashford. "And you, Mr. Ashford?" "Sometimes young men have keys for cigarette cases. Or motor cars." Peter smiled too broadly. "Not mine, I'm afraid." Dr. Graves shook his head before she even asked. "No." Mrs. Hart spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "No." Mrs. Judith Lane gave a small laugh. "If it were mine, I should have noticed. I lose many things, but not keys." Miss Marple let the responses settle. No one claimed it. No one looked relieved. Instead, the room felt tighter, as if the key had been a question, and everyone feared the answer. Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room with the key in her hand. She placed it on the mantel beside the clock. Not hidden, not protected, simply displayed. It was a quiet decision, but a powerful one. A key on a mantel, near a clock, felt like a statement. Mr. Weatherby's eyes flicked toward it, and then away again. "Now," he said quickly, "who would like some more champagne? It would be a shame to let it go to waste." It was a distraction. It was clearly meant to be. But the guests followed it because distractions were safer than truth. Miss Cora Finch hurried to pour. Peter Ashford made a bright remark about how the year could only improve. Mrs. Judith Lane laughed politely. Dr. Graves spoke of the importance of health. Miss Marple listened, but her mind had moved deeper. The key belonged to something. The key had been placed where it would be found, yet not claimed. The key had entered the room at midnight, the exact moment when the house was focused on ritual and noise and glass clinking. A person could move easily at that moment. A person could place something somewhere. A person could retrieve something and hide it, or hide it and later retrieve it. A person could use the sound of bells and greetings to cover a quiet action. Miss Marple's eyes returned to the clock. It ticked steadily, as though it had done nothing wrong. Yet she still remembered the slight misalignment of the minute hand, the host's repeated glances, the earlier adjustment. She rose again, slowly, and moved closer to the mantel, pretending to admire a small framed photograph beside the clock. Mr. Weatherby noticed at once. He stepped nearer too, smiling, speaking lightly. "That is my mother," he said, gesturing toward the photograph. "She adored New Year." Miss Marple smiled. "How lovely." Her eyes drifted, as if by accident, behind the clock. A thin edge of paper was visible there. Barely, a small folded note, pressed into the narrow space between the clock and the wall. It had been hidden quickly, not carefully. It looked like something placed in haste. Miss Marple did not reach for it. She was not alone at the mantel. Mr. Weatherby stood close. His presence was protective, territorial. Instead, she allowed her gaze to drift away again. She turned and spoke to Major Slate, who stood near the fire. "Major Slate," she said, gently drawing him into conversation, "you must have experienced many New Year nights in your time." Major Slate stepped closer, his calm voice steady. Quite a few. Miss Marple nodded. I always think the most interesting thing about such nights is how people behave when they believe time has a meaning beyond minutes. Major Slate's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in attention. He understood her style. He understood she rarely spoke without purpose. Mr. Weatherby interjected quickly. Oh, time is time, Miss Marple. 1 minute is like another. Miss Marple smiled politely. Is it? I wonder. Midnight seems to make people believe they can become new, simply by waiting for a bell. Major Slate gave a small, thoughtful sound. Some do. Miss Marple's gaze moved to the guests again. Mrs. Hart sat very still. Dr. Graves stood too upright. Peter Ashford kept glancing at the mantel. Mrs. Judith Lane watched Miss Marple with polite interest that was edged with calculation. Then Miss Cora Finch, perhaps trying to restore harmlessness, asked if anyone would like tea. Her voice had the brittle brightness of someone trying to keep the surface smooth. Mr. Weatherby seized on the suggestion at once. Excellent idea. Tea will be perfect. Tea arrived a few minutes later, carried on a tray by the servant. Cups were set out. Sugar offered. Milk poured. The ritual of tea gave the guests something to do with their hands. Something safe. Miss Marple accepted a cup and held it, warming her fingers. Then she said, in her mildest tone, "That is such a charming clock, Mr. Weatherby. It keeps very steady time." Mr. Weatherby smiled. "Yes, it's been in the family." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, as if curious. "And has it always been accurate?" A pause. It was brief. "But it happened," Mr. Weatherby replied, "as accurate as any clock can be." Miss Marple nodded. "Of course. I only ask because sometimes older clocks can be set a little fast or a little slow. One might never notice, unless one were watching closely." Dr. Graves' eyes flicked toward Mr. Weatherby. Peter Ashford's mouth tightened. Mrs. Hart's breath caught, soft and quick. Mrs. Judith Lane lifted her cup and took a sip to hide her expression. Mr. Weatherby's smile remained, but it now looked pinned in place. "I assure you," he said, "it's perfectly fine." Miss Marple did not challenge him. She simply smiled and took a sip of tea. But in her mind, the shape sharpened. A clock that might be wrong. A key that appeared at midnight. A note hidden behind the clock. A memory box used as ritual. A group of guests acting as though they had rehearsed their calm. This was not a random unease. This was coordination. Not necessarily spoken coordination, but the kind that grew out of shared fear and shared history. The kind where people learned which subjects to avoid and which smiles to wear. Miss Marple looked at the note again, just the edge of it visible, like a secret not fully buried. She waited. Waiting was not passive. For her, waiting was a method. It allowed people to betray themselves in small ways. It allowed impatience and guilt to rise. And then, almost as if the house itself wished to force the next move, the servant returned to the room and spoke quietly to Mr. Weatherby. "Sir," the servant said, "there is a matter upstairs, in the study corridor. I thought you should know." Mr. Weatherby's face changed. Only slightly. Only for a second. But Miss Marple saw it. His polite expression faltered, and something darker moved beneath it. He recovered quickly. "Excuse me," he said, his tone smooth. "Just a small household matter. Please continue enjoying yourselves." He turned toward the hall. Peter Ashford moved as if to follow, then stopped, uncertain. Dr. Graves's eyes widened. Mrs. Hart's hand tightened around her cup. Mrs. Judith Lane set her cup down with careful precision, as though she had decided something. Miss Marple remained seated for a moment longer, watching the choreography. Then she rose, calm and unhurried, and followed at a gentle distance. Not because she wished to intrude, but because the first true event of the new year had just announced itself. And in Ravenhurst House, the rehearsed celebration was beginning to crack. Chapter 3. the door that was not meant to be opened. The corridor upstairs carried a different silence from the rooms below. It was not the gentle quiet of candlelight and conversation, but a deeper stillness, the kind that seemed to wait rather than rest. The carpet absorbed sound, and the walls, lined with old photographs and framed letters, appeared to lean inward as though listening. Miss Marple climbed the stairs slowly, her hand resting lightly on the banister. Her steps measured and unhurried. Ahead of her, Mr. Weatherby moved with careful speed. He did not run. He did not rush. But there was purpose in the way he walked, a tension that made his shoulders slightly rigid. The servant followed a few steps behind him, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the corridor ahead. Neither spoke. Words, Miss Marple suspected, felt dangerous just now. The study corridor lay at the far end of the upper floor. It was a narrow passage with doors on either side, each leading to rooms rarely used by guests. The air here felt cooler, as though warmth had not fully reached it. At the end of the corridor stood the study door, solid, dark, and usually kept locked. Tonight it stood open. Miss Marple noticed that at once. The door was not flung wide, but it was open enough to reveal a sliver of lamplight inside. A faint shadow fell across the carpet, sharp-edged, unmistakable. Mr. Weatherby stopped short, as though the sight of the open door had struck him physically. His hand rose slightly, then fell again. The servant halted behind him, his breath audible now, shallow and uncertain. Miss Marple remained a few paces back, allowing the scene to arrange itself. She understood that people often needed a moment to face what they feared. Rushing them only hardened their resistance. Inside the study, something had changed. The study had always been Mr. Weatherby's private domain, a room arranged with precision and habit. Miss Marple had glimpsed it once earlier that evening, when she had been shown upstairs to freshen herself. At that time, everything had been in order. Papers neatly stacked, desk cleared, chairs placed exactly. The room had spoken of control. Now, it spoke of disturbance. The lamp on the desk was lit, though it should have been extinguished for the night. A chair lay tipped at an awkward angle, one leg caught against the desk. Papers were scattered across the floor, their neat arrangement destroyed. A drawer in the desk stood open, its contents partially pulled out as though someone had searched in haste. Mr. Weatherby stepped forward, his movements stiff. He crossed the threshold and stopped just inside the room, his gaze moving rapidly from one detail to the next. His breathing quickened, though he tried to keep it quiet. Miss Marple entered last, her presence gentle, almost unobtrusive. She did not immediately examine the room. Instead, she watched Mr. Weatherby. She watched the way his eyes lingered on the open drawer, then moved quickly away. She watched the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his hand curled briefly before relaxing again. "What is it, sir?" the servant asked quietly. Mr. Weatherby did not answer at once. He walked to the desk and looked down at the open drawer. His hand hovered above it, then withdrew, as if he feared touching it would confirm something he was not yet ready to accept. "Someone has been in here," he said finally. It was an unnecessary statement. The room itself had already said it. Miss Marple moved closer now, her eyes lowering to the scattered papers. She did not bend to pick any up. She merely noted their position, the way some had been kicked aside, the way others lay face down. She noticed the desk chair, its position unnatural. She noticed a faint scuff on the carpet near the door, as though a foot had turned sharply there. "Do you keep the study locked?" she asked gently. Mr. Weatherby hesitated, only for a moment. But the moment mattered. "Yes," he said. "Always." Miss Marple nodded. Then whoever entered must have had a key. The words hung in the air. Mr. Weatherby's eyes flicked to her face. There was something there now that had not been before. Fear, yes, but also calculation. He was measuring how much she understood, and how dangerous that understanding might be. The servant shifted uncomfortably. Should I fetch the others, sir? Mr. Weatherby's reply came too quickly. No. Then, realizing how sharp the refusal sounded, he softened it. Not yet. Let us first understand what has happened. Miss Marple agreed silently. Understanding always came before spectacle. She stepped fully into the room now and allowed her gaze to travel over the desk. The open drawer caught her attention. Inside, she could see the remains of an orderly system disrupted. Files, envelopes, a small locked box pushed aside, its position altered. Her eyes narrowed slightly. A locked box, she said quietly. Is it usually kept there? Mr. Weatherby swallowed. Yes. And is it still locked? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the drawer and lifted the box. It was small, dark wood, unadorned. He turned it in his hands. The lock hung open, the keyhole exposed. The box had been opened. Miss Marple felt the room settle into a deeper silence. This was no longer a matter of curiosity. This was the beginning of something far more serious. What was kept inside? She asked. Mr. Weatherby's grip tightened on the box. Personal papers. Miss Marple waited. He did not elaborate. Personal papers, she repeated gently, often the most dangerous kind. Mr. Weatherby's mouth tightened. You assume too much, Miss Marple. She met his gaze calmly. I assume only that someone risked a great deal to open that box. That suggests whatever was inside mattered very much. He looked away. The servant cleared his throat nervously. Sir, I really think the others should be told. Mr. Weatherby nodded, reluctantly. Very well. The servant hurried away, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Miss Marple remained still, her eyes returning to the desk. Something else caught her attention now. A faint mark on the polished surface, a lighter rectangle where an object had once rested. What sat there? She asked, pointing gently. Mr. Weatherby followed her gesture. His face drained slightly. A letter. A letter, Miss Marple echoed, and it is gone. Yes. The word came out flat, stripped of warmth. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to absorb this. A letter removed from the study. A box opened, a key appearing at midnight. A clock adjusted. A note hidden behind the clock downstairs. Everything was aligning. The sound of voices rose from below as the servant informed the guests. Footsteps soon followed, hesitant at first, then quicker. Peter Ashford arrived first, his face pale, his eyes wide. Dr. Graves followed, composed, but tense. Mrs. Hart appeared next, her hand gripping the banister. Mrs. Judith Lane ascended last, her expression carefully arranged, curiosity balanced with concern. Major Slate came quietly, his presence steady. They gathered at the threshold, peering into the room. What has happened? Mrs. Hart asked softly. Mr. Weatherby straightened. Someone has been in my study. The words landed heavily. Peter Ashford stepped inside, then stopped, as if he had crossed an invisible boundary. Are you sure? Miss Marple watched him closely. His question sounded reasonable, but his eyes betrayed recognition, not surprise. Yes, Mr. Weatherby replied. Very sure. Dr. Graves surveyed the room with professional calm. Was anything taken? Mr. Weatherby hesitated again. Then, reluctantly, a letter. Mrs. Judith Lane tilted her head slightly. What sort of letter? A private one, he said sharply. Miss Marple intervened gently. Private letters often become public matters when they are removed without permission. Her voice was calm, but the truth of her words settled uneasily among them. Major Slate spoke for the first time. If someone entered this room tonight, they did so while everyone believed they were accounted for. The implication was clear. The guests exchanged glances. Suspicion flickered, subtle and quick. Miss Marple moved toward the desk again. May I? Mr. Weatherby nodded stiffly. She bent slightly, examining the drawer and the box. She noticed something small then, something that might easily have been missed. The box's lock showed a faint scratch, as if a key had been inserted quickly and without care. Not every key fit every lock perfectly. She straightened. "Who else has keys to this study?" she asked. Mr. Weatherby answered reluctantly. "Only myself. And my solicitor." Miss Marple said nothing. Her eyes drifted to the doorway, to the guests gathered there, to their faces, their hands, their postures. A key had appeared downstairs. A study had been entered, and a letter had been taken. The last hour of the year had not ended quietly after all. It had ended with intention. And Miss Marple, standing in the disturbed study of Ravenhurst House, knew the true mystery had finally begun. The study seemed to hold its breath as the guests stood within it, each person measuring their words, their expressions, their distance from one another. The lamplight cast long shadows across the scattered papers, stretching them into shapes that felt heavier than paper should feel. Miss Marple noticed how no one stepped too close to the desk now. It had become a boundary, a silent accusation. Mr. Weatherby set the opened box down carefully, as though rough handling might cause its contents to speak. He closed the drawer with deliberate care, restoring a small piece of order that did nothing to ease the tension. "This is most unpleasant," Mrs. Hart said quietly. "Surely it is a misunderstanding." Miss Marple looked at her with gentle interest. Misunderstandings rarely leave drawers open. Mrs. Hart flushed slightly and said no more. Dr. Graves moved closer to the desk, his hands clasped behind his back. "Was the letter recent?" Mr. Weatherby nodded. "Very." "Then it may not be far," Dr. Graves said. "A person might not have had time to destroy it." Miss Marple listened carefully. "Destroy. Not hide. Not read. Destroy." Peter Ashford spoke quickly. "This is ridiculous. Someone must have wandered upstairs by mistake." Miss Marple turned toward him. "Mistakes rarely involve locked rooms." Peter laughed nervously. "Well, old houses have quirks." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "They do. And so do people." Silence followed. Mrs. Judith Lane broke it with a smooth tone. "Perhaps the important thing is not how the letter was taken, but why." Miss Marple agreed silently. Why always mattered more than how. She walked slowly around the room now, her steps unhurried, her gaze attentive. She examined the carpet, the desk, the chair. Near the window she noticed a faint smear on the glass, as though someone had steadied themselves there. She noted it, then moved on. At the edge of the desk lay a single sheet of paper, folded and then unfolded again. Its creases softened. It had not been taken. It had been discarded. "May I?" she asked. Mr. Weatherby nodded again, resigned now. Miss Marple lifted the paper. It was blank on one side. On the other, a single sentence had been written, then crossed out heavily. She did not read it aloud. She did not need to. She folded the paper again and held it. "This," she said gently, "appears to be a draft. Someone practiced." Mr. Weatherby's face hardened. "Practiced what?" "Writing something difficult." Dr. Graves's eyes narrowed. "Like a confession?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. "Or an accusation?" The room shifted. Major Slate spoke quietly. "Whatever was taken, it frightened someone enough to act during a gathering." Miss Marple nodded. "And to act at midnight?" She looked at Mr. Weatherby. "When did you last see the letter?" He hesitated. "Then, earlier this evening, before the guests arrived." "Yes? And it was still here when you went downstairs for the celebration?" He nodded. Miss Marple felt the pattern sharpen. "Then the letter was taken during the gathering." Mrs. Hart sank into a chair. "That means that it was taken while everyone believed everyone else was present." Miss Marple finished. A new silence followed, heavier than before. Miss Marple turned toward the guests. "We should all return downstairs," she said calmly. "This room will wait." People, however, often reveal more when they believe the moment has passed. Mr. Weatherby looked relieved, though he tried not to show it. Yes, of course. They descended the stairs together, their footsteps echoing faintly now, no longer softened by celebration. The drawing-room greeted them with the same warm fire and gentle music, but it no longer felt comforting. It felt staged. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her posture relaxed, her expression mild. She held the folded paper discreetly in her hand. The guests resumed their positions, but they were no longer performing for one another. They were watching. Mr. Weatherby poured himself a drink he did not seem to want. Peter Ashford stood rather than sat, pacing slightly. Dr. Graves chose a chair and sat stiffly. Mrs. Hart stared into the fire. Mrs. Judith Lane observed everyone with polite attentiveness. Miss Cora Finch hovered near the sideboard, pale and quiet. Miss Marple waited. Waiting, she knew, was often the most revealing action of all. After several minutes she spoke. "I imagine," she said gently, "that the letter concerns something that affected more than one person." No one responded. She continued, "I imagine it was not flattering, possibly not kind, and certainly not convenient." Mrs. Judith Lane smiled faintly. "You imagine quite a lot, Miss Marple." Miss Marple returned the smile. "I imagine, because people behave as though they have rehearsed their innocence." Peter Ashford stopped pacing. "This is absurd. Is it?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Then why does everyone look as though they are afraid of remembering?" The question hung in the air. Miss Marple unfolded the paper slowly. "This draft," she said, "suggests that someone wished to put something into words, but could not quite bring themselves to do it." Mr. Weatherby spoke sharply. "That paper is mine." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, I believe it is." She met his gaze calmly. "You were preparing to confront someone." His jaw tightened. He did not deny it. Miss Marple continued. "And someone realized that confrontation would change everything." Mrs. Hart's breath caught. Dr. Graves looked down. Peter Ashford's hands clenched. Mrs. Judith Lane tilted her head slightly. "And you believe that person stole the letter?" "I believe," Miss Marple said, "that the letter was not stolen to keep a secret." The room leaned in. "It was stolen to prevent a truth from being spoken at the wrong moment." Major Slate spoke quietly. "Wrong for whom?" Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly across the room. "For all of you." Silence answered her. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, cold and indifferent. Inside Ravenhurst House, the new year had fully arrived now, and it carried with it the weight of what the old year refused to release. Miss Marple folded the paper again and placed it on the table beside her. "The last hour of the year," she said softly, "was chosen carefully. Whoever acted believed that time itself would protect them." She looked at the clock on the mantel, its ticking steady and relentless. "But time," she added, "has a way of correcting itself." The guests sat very still, and Miss Marple knew that before this night ended, the truth hidden behind the celebration would no longer be able to remain silent. Chapter 4. Everyone has an alibi except time. The drawing room had changed its character. It no longer felt like a place meant for gathering, but like a chamber where words were weighed carefully before being released. The fire still burned, but its warmth seemed symbolic now, unable to soften the air between the people seated around it. Miss Marple felt the shift clearly. This was the moment when everyone believed themselves to be under quiet examination. Mr. Weatherby stood by the mantel, his posture rigid, his glass untouched. Peter Ashford remained standing, his movement restless but restrained, as though pacing would betray more than he wished. Dr. Graves sat upright in his chair, hands folded, his expression composed but strained. Mrs. Hart stared into the flames as if they might erase what she feared. Miss Cora Finch remained near the sideboard, her hands clasped together, offering usefulness without being asked. Mrs. Judith Lane sat gracefully, her calm polished and intact. Major Slate occupied his chair like a fixed point, unmoving and observant. Miss Marple sat quietly, allowing the room to settle into its discomfort. "It would be sensible," Dr. Graves said at last, his voice measured, "to establish where everyone was during the last hour of the year." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Yes, time will be our guide." Mr. Weatherby seized upon the suggestion. "Of course. That is the logical thing to do." Miss Marple noted the word logical. It was often used as a shield. Dr. Graves continued. "Perhaps we should each explain our movements from 11 until midnight." Peter Ashford nodded too quickly. "I can do that." Miss Marple smiled gently. "In your own time." They began with Mr. Weatherby. He spoke of greeting guests, of overseeing refreshments, of standing by the mantel during the countdown. His account was smooth, detailed, and confident. He mentioned specific moments, specific words spoken, as though memory itself had been rehearsed. Miss Marple listened, without interruption. Next came Mrs. Hart. Her voice was soft, careful. She described sitting by the fire, speaking with Dr. Graves, stepping into the dining room briefly to fetch her shawl. She avoided detail where she could, and Miss Marple noticed how her hands tightened each time she mentioned the upstairs corridor. Dr. Graves spoke next. His account was precise. He had been in the drawing room, then briefly in the dining room, then back again. He referenced the toast, the bells, the sound from the hall. His tone suggested professional reliability, the voice of a man accustomed to being believed. Peter Ashford followed, his explanation delivered with nervous enthusiasm. He had moved between rooms, admired paintings, spoken with several people. He emphasized how visible he had been, how present. Miss Marple noted that people who emphasized presence often feared absence. Miss Cora Finch spoke next. She had been preparing refreshments, arranging trays, offering champagne. Her account was full of activity, full of service. She seemed almost eager to drown the room in details. Mrs. Judith Lane spoke last. Her explanation was elegant, light, and apparently effortless. She had remained mostly in the drawing room, spoken with several guests, stepped to the window briefly. Her tone suggested that nothing of consequence had occurred at all. Miss Marple waited until the room had finished speaking. "And you, Major Slate?" she asked gently. He replied simply. "I was where I appeared to be." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Thank you." Silence followed. "All very tidy," Miss Marple said softly. Mr. Weatherby nodded. "Exactly." No one could have been upstairs. Miss Marple did not argue. She did not accuse. She merely asked a question. Who watched the clock? The question seemed almost absurd at first. Then its weight settled. Peter Ashford frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Miss Marple said calmly, "who was paying attention to the precise moment of midnight?" Mrs. Hart shifted. Dr. Graves looked thoughtful. Mr. Weatherby's jaw tightened. The clock, Miss Marple continued, was central to the evening. Everyone gathered around it. Everyone trusted it. She rose slowly and walked to the mantel. "Yet clocks are curious things," she said. "They appear impartial, but they can be adjusted." She turned the clock slightly, revealing the space behind it. The folded note lay there, undeniable now. A collective breath was drawn. Miss Marple lifted the note carefully and unfolded it. She did not read it aloud. She did not need to. "This," she said gently, "was placed here deliberately. It was hidden quickly. And it was hidden by someone who knew no one would look here during the celebration." Mr. Weatherby spoke sharply. "You are assuming." "I am observing," Miss Marple replied. She looked at the clock face. The minute hand is slightly misaligned. It suggests the clock was adjusted recently, not enough to be noticed casually. Enough to change time. Dr. Graves leaned forward. Change it how? By a few minutes, Miss Marple said. Just enough. Peter Ashford's face drained of colour. That's ridiculous, is it? Miss Marple asked gently. If the clock were set ahead, the bells outside would ring before midnight in this room. Everyone would believe the year had changed. Major Slate nodded slowly, meaning someone could move unseen. Miss Marple smiled at him. Precisely. Mr. Weatherby's voice was tight. That would require access to the clock. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. And knowledge. She looked around the room. Someone adjusted the clock earlier in the evening. Someone ensured that when the bells rang, the house would believe midnight had arrived. That created a window. A small one. But enough. Mrs. Hart whispered. Enough for what? For someone to leave the room, Miss Marple said. Go upstairs, unlock the study, remove the letter, and return without raising suspicion. Silence thickened. Dr. Graves exhaled slowly. Then the alibis are flawed. Not flawed, Miss Marple corrected. Manufactured. Peter Ashford shook his head. But everyone was here. Yes, Miss Marple said. At the wrong time. She returned to her chair. The alibi depends on the clock, she continued. And the clock cannot be trusted. Mr. Weatherby's voice was barely controlled. You are suggesting deception. Miss Marple met his gaze calmly. I am suggesting intention. The room absorbed that word. Outside, a faint wind moved through the trees, brushing against the windows like a reminder that time did not stop simply because people wished it to. Miss Marple folded the note again and placed it beside the key on the mantel. Now, she said softly, we must ask not who could have done this, but who needed to. The house seemed to respond to Miss Marple's words with a deeper stillness. The clock continued its steady ticking, each second measured and relentless, as if determined to assert its authority again. Yet no one trusted it now. Time itself had become suspect. Mr. Weatherby moved away from the mantel. His earlier control slipping, he poured himself another drink, his hand unsteady. This is madness, he said. You are turning an evening into a trial. Miss Marple remained seated, her posture relaxed. Trials happen when truth resists being quiet. Dr. Graves spoke carefully. If the clock was adjusted, someone would have had to do it when others were present. Yes, Miss Marple said. That is the cleverness of it. She looked toward Miss Cora Finch. You were arranging the mantel earlier, were you not? Miss Finch nodded quickly, yes. I straightened things. Just tidying. And the clock? Miss Marple asked. I may have dusted near it, Miss Finch said. I don't recall touching it. Miss Marple nodded. You would not. Dusting does not move minute hands. Miss Finch swallowed. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Judith Lane. You admired the clock earlier. Mrs. Lane smiled faintly. I admire many things. Did you touch it? Miss Marple asked gently. No, Mrs. Lane replied smoothly. Miss Marple turned to Peter Ashford. You stood near the mantel often. Peter shrugged. I like old objects. Miss Marple turned to Dr. Graves. You mentioned time being psychological. Dr. Graves stiffened. I speak professionally. Indeed, Miss Marple said. And professionally, you understand how people respond to cues. Major Slate spoke quietly. Someone used the room's trust in ritual. Miss Marple smiled at him. Yes, she allowed her gaze to settle on Mr. Weatherby. And someone knew exactly what was at risk if that letter were read aloud. Mr. Weatherby said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm. The letter was recent. It was written in response to something discovered, something involving more than one person. Mrs. Hart's voice trembled. You cannot know that. I know it because no one here appears surprised. Miss Marple replied gently. Mrs. Hart looked away. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. The letter threatened a balance. The kind of balance that allows people to sit in a room together and pretend. Peter Ashford spoke sharply. Pretend what? That the past is finished, Miss Marple said. Silence answered her. She gestured toward the key on the mantel. The study was unlocked with a key that does not quite fit. That suggests haste. Fear. Dr. Graves nodded reluctantly. A poorly fitting key leaves marks. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, she stood again, her movements unhurried. Who knew the study contained that letter? Mr. Weatherby's voice was flat. No one. Miss Marple met his gaze. Then you were planning to tell someone. Mrs. Hart inhaled sharply. Miss Marple turned toward her. Were you expecting a confrontation? Mrs. Hart's eyes filled with restrained emotion. I was expecting honesty. Miss Marple nodded. Honesty frightens people. She turned toward Dr. Graves. And consequences frighten them more. Dr. Graves's composure cracked for the first time. You are implying. I am implying nothing, Miss Marple said gently. I am listening. She returned to her chair and folded her hands. Someone here believed that if the year ended without that letter being read, the danger would pass, she said. They believed time would protect them. She looked at the clock again. But time does not erase truth, she continued. It only delays it. Major Slate spoke quietly. What happens now? Miss Marple smiled, calm and certain. Now we wait. For what? Peter Ashford asked. For impatience, Miss Marple replied. For guilt. For someone to try to correct what they believe is unfinished. She glanced at the stairs. The letter was taken, she said. But it was not destroyed. Mr. Weatherby stiffened. How can you know that? Because if it had been destroyed, Miss Marple said softly, you would be relieved. The room seemed to contract around him. Miss Marple continued. Instead, you are afraid of where it might reappear. She let the silence stretch. The clock ticked on. Seconds passed. Each one carried weight, and Miss Marple knew that time, once manipulated, would now begin to betray the person who tried to control it. Chapter 5. When the past refuses to stay buried. The waiting Miss Marple had suggested did not last long. Waiting rarely did when guilt had already begun to stir. Ravenhurst House seemed to sense it too. The walls held sound more tightly now, as though the house itself were listening for the wrong footstep, the wrong breath taken too quickly. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded, her gaze soft but attentive. She did not look at any one person for long. Instead, she allowed the room to reveal itself in fragments, in the small betrayals of posture and breath. Mr. Weatherby paced near the mantel, his earlier composure thinning with every step. The clock's ticking followed him like a reminder he could not outrun. Peter Ashford stood near the window, his reflection faintly visible in the glass, doubled and distorted. Dr. Graves remained seated but no longer relaxed, his shoulders tight, his jaw set. Mrs. Hart sat with her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. Miss Cora Finch hovered uncertainly, unsure now whether usefulness would protect her. Mrs. Judith Lane watched them all, her calm now sharpened into watchfulness. Major Slate remained steady, his presence grounding the room. Miss Marple spoke at last. There is a particular quality to secrets that involve more than one person, she said gently. They do not stay quiet on their own. They require cooperation. Mr. Weatherby stopped pacing. You keep suggesting a shared past. I do not suggest it, Miss Marple replied. You demonstrate it. Mrs. Hart's breath caught. That is unfair. Is it? Miss Marple asked softly. Then why does everyone here seem afraid of the same moment? No one answered. Miss Marple continued. The letter was written recently, but its content was not new. It was a response to something long avoided. She turned her gaze toward Mrs. Hart. You were expecting honesty. Mrs. Hart's voice trembled. I was expecting closure. Miss Marple nodded. Closure is rarely welcomed by those who benefit from things remaining open. Mrs. Hart looked at Mr. Weatherby then, her eyes filled with restrained emotion. You said you would tell them. The words fell into the room like a dropped glass. Peter Ashford turned sharply. Tell us what? Mr. Weatherby's face hardened. This is not the time. Miss Marple did not interrupt. She allowed the moment to widen. Mrs. Hart's voice strengthened. It was always supposed to be told, years ago, but it was easier to stay silent. Dr. Graves closed his eyes briefly. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Years ago, she repeated. So the past has finally arrived. Mrs. Judith Lane spoke smoothly. Everyone has pasts. That does not explain burglary. Miss Marple looked at her calmly. Pasts do not explain actions. Fear does. She turned back to Mrs. Hart. What happened? Mrs. Hart hesitated, then spoke, her words careful, measured. There was an arrangement, a financial one. It involved trust, and it went wrong. Mr. Weatherby said sharply, You are oversimplifying. Mrs. Hart ignored him. Someone was blamed. Someone else benefited. Peter Ashford's face paled. You are talking about the company. Dr. Graves inhaled slowly. Miss Marple observed all of this quietly. The letter, she said, was meant to correct a story that has been told the wrong way for many years. Mr. Weatherby's voice was low. That story kept us safe. Safe from what? Major Slate asked quietly. Mr. Weatherby did not answer. Miss Marple continued. The past does not stay buried when too many people are standing on it. She looked toward Dr. Graves. You are a man accustomed to records and responsibility. Dr. Graves stiffened. I kept accounts. That was my role, and did you notice irregularities? Miss Marple asked. Dr. Graves hesitated. At the time, no. Miss Marple nodded. At the time, you trusted what you were shown. Peter Ashford spoke suddenly. This is pointless. Whatever happened then has nothing to do with tonight. Miss Marple met his gaze calmly. On the contrary, it has everything to do with tonight. She gestured toward the clock. The letter threatened to speak when everyone was present. That is why time itself was manipulated. Mrs. Judith Lane's voice was light, but edged. You give that letter a great deal of importance. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Only because someone risked so much to silence it. She rose and walked slowly toward the window, looking out into the dark garden where frost gleamed faintly. When people believe the past is safely behind them, they become careless. When they realize it is returning, they become desperate. Mrs. Hart's voice broke. It was never supposed to be like this. Miss Marple turned back. It rarely is. Mr. Weatherby spoke then, his voice controlled but strained. The letter accused me of something I did not do. Miss Marple did not argue. She simply asked, Then why were you afraid to let it be read? He did not answer. Silence pressed in again, heavier now, filled with meaning. Miss Marple returned to her chair. Someone took the letter, she said calmly. But they did not resolve the problem. They delayed it. Major Slate nodded. Delay often makes things worse. Miss Marple agreed. Yes. She glanced toward the stairs again. And delay invites mistakes. At that moment, a faint sound drifted down from the upper floor. Not a loud sound, not a dramatic one, just the subtle creak of a floorboard. Peter Ashford stiffened. Dr. Graves rose halfway from his chair. Mrs. Hart gasped softly. Miss Marple remained still. There, she said quietly. Impatience. Mr. Weatherby turned toward the stairs. That is impossible. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. Someone has gone back. To the study? Peter Ashford asked. Miss Marple nodded. Or somewhere connected to it. Major Slate rose at once. We should not go alone, Miss Marple agreed. No, we should all see what the past is trying to do. They moved together toward the stairs, their earlier divisions temporarily forgotten. The house seemed narrower now, the corridor longer. Each step carried weight. At the top of the stairs, the study corridor lay ahead again, dim and watchful. And this time, the door at the end of it was closed. The closed study door felt heavier than it should have been. It was not locked, Miss Marple sensed that at once, but it carried the unmistakable weight of a decision made in haste. The group halted several paces away, instinctively, as though crossing the remaining distance might change something irrevocably. Major Slate reached the door first. He paused, listening. There was no sound from within. No movement, just silence. Miss Marple stepped forward beside him. "Whoever is inside believes they are correcting an error," she said softly. Major Slate opened the door. The study greeted them with lamplight once more, but the disorder had increased. The desk drawer was open again. Papers lay scattered more widely now, some crushed underfoot. The small wooden box rested open on the desk, and beside it stood Mrs. Judith Lane. She did not turn immediately. She stood with her back to them, one hand resting on the desk, the other holding a folded letter. "I wondered how long it would take," she said calmly. The room froze. Miss Marple spoke gently. "You returned for it." Mrs. Lane turned then, her expression composed, her eyes bright with something close to relief. "Yes." Peter Ashford's voice shook. "Judith, what are you doing?" "Finishing what should have been finished years ago," Mrs. Lane replied. Mr. Weatherby stepped forward. "Give me that letter." She smiled faintly. "No." Miss Marple observed her closely. "You were not afraid of the letter," she said. "You were afraid of it being read at the wrong time." Mrs. Lane inclined her head slightly. "You understand?" Miss Marple nodded. "You wanted control." Mrs. Lane sighed softly. "Control is the only thing that keeps chaos manageable." Dr. Graves spoke quietly. "What is in that letter?" Mrs. Lane looked at him. "The truth." Silence answered her. Miss Marple stepped closer. "You were part of the arrangement." Mrs. Lane smiled. "Of course I was. I negotiated it." Mrs. Hart's voice broke. "You promised it would be resolved." "And it was," Mrs. Lane replied. "In the most convenient way." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Convenient for whom?" "For those who understood how fragile reputations are," Mrs. Lane said. She looked at Mr. Weatherby. "You were willing to let it surface. That was your mistake." Mr. Weatherby's face drained. "You took it to protect yourself." Mrs. Lane shook her head. "I took it to protect everyone from consequences they pretended not to want." Miss Marple spoke gently. "That is not protection. That is preservation of a lie, Mrs." Lane held the letter up slightly. "This letter names names. It connects decisions. It assigns responsibility." Major Slate's voice was steady. "And you intended to decide when it would be known." "Yes," Mrs. Lane said. "Just not tonight," Miss Marple nodded. "Because tonight, everyone was present." Mrs. Lane smiled thinly. "Exactly." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And because if everyone heard it at once, no one could deny it." Mrs. Lane's smile faded. Miss Marple continued. "You adjusted the clock to create confusion. You placed the key where it would be found later, not sooner. You hid the note to misdirect attention. You counted on the celebration to blind people." Mrs. Lane did not deny it. "You believed time could be shaped," Miss Marple said, "that the last hour of the year could be rewritten." Mrs. Lane lowered the letter slightly. "I believed it could be postponed." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Truth does not respect postponement." Mrs. Lane looked at the faces around her. The anger, the hurt, the realization. Her shoulders sagged slightly. "It was never supposed to come to this," she said quietly. Miss Marple held out her hand. "Then let it end properly." For a moment it seemed as though Mrs. Lane might tear the letter. Her fingers tightened. Then slowly, deliberately, she placed it in Miss Marple's hand. Miss Marple unfolded it. She did not read it aloud immediately. She looked at Mr. Weatherby first, then at Mrs. Hart, then at Dr. Graves, then at Peter Ashford. "You are all named," she said softly, "in different ways, for different actions, and different silences." The room absorbed that truth. Miss Marple folded the letter again. "This letter will be read. Not here, not tonight. But it will be read. Mrs. Lane exhaled slowly. Then the past has finally caught up. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. She looked at the clock in the study, its hands moving steadily now, unaltered. The new year has begun, she said calmly, and with it, accountability. The house seemed to release a breath it had been holding, and Miss Marple, standing quietly with the truth in her hands, knew the final hour had done exactly what it was meant to do. It had ended the lie. Chapter 6. The detail no one thought important. The study felt different now that the truth had been held openly, even if it had not yet been spoken aloud. The lamplight no longer seemed accusatory. It simply illuminated what was already there. Miss Marple stood quietly near the desk, the folded letter resting in her hands, while the others remained where they were, uncertain whether to move closer or farther away. Mrs. Judith Lane sat slowly in the chair beside the desk, the confidence she had carried so carefully beginning to soften into something closer to weariness. Mr. Weatherby stood opposite her, his face drawn, his certainty eroded. Mrs. Hart leaned against the doorframe, her breath uneven, her gaze fixed on the floor. Dr. Graves had retreated a step, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. Peter Ashford hovered near the window, his earlier restlessness replaced by a stunned stillness. Major Slate stood apart, steady and watchful. Miss Marple waited. Waiting was not a pause for her. It was an invitation. After a moment, Dr. Graves spoke, his voice low. You said there was one detail that would correct everything. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Yes. Mrs. Lane looked up. If you have the letter, what else could possibly matter? Miss Marple smiled gently. Letters tell us what people intended to say. Details tell us what they actually did. She walked to the desk and set the letter down beside the open wooden box. Then, she reached into the drawer and lifted a single object that had been pushed aside earlier. It was small, easily overlooked, a narrow leather folder, worn at the edges, the kind that held receipts or notes no one bothered to sort. This, she said softly, is what was missed. Mr. Weatherby frowned. That folder has been there for years. Exactly, Miss Marple replied. Which is why no one thought to look inside it. She opened the folder carefully. Inside were several folded slips of paper, yellowed with age, each bearing neat handwriting. Dr. Graves's breath caught. Those are old records, Miss Marple finished. Not official ones. Personal ones. She held up a slip. Dates, times, small amounts of money. Nothing that would attract attention on its own. Mrs. Hart stepped forward slightly. I remember those. Miss Marple nodded. They record moments when the official story did not quite match reality. Mrs. Lane's voice was calm, but edged now. You are digging unnecessarily deep. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. Depth is where truth often hides. She laid the slips out on the desk, arranging them carefully. These notes span several months. They show payments made quietly, adjustments justified later, responsibilities shifted without explanation. Dr. Graves's composure finally cracked. Those were temporary measures. Miss Marple met his gaze. Temporary measures have a habit of becoming permanent. She turned toward Mr. Weatherby. And this folder explains why the letter frightened you. Mr. Weatherby swallowed. The letter accused me of deception. Miss Marple nodded. And these notes prove that deception was not yours alone. Silence settled. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm and clear. The letter was written because someone rediscovered this folder. Mrs. Hart's voice trembled. I found it. All eyes turned to her. I was looking for something else, Mrs. Hart said. I did not understand what it meant at first. Then I did. Miss Marple nodded. And you asked for honesty? Mrs. Hart nodded, tears gathering. Yes. Miss Marple looked at Mrs. Lane. And you realized the past was no longer safely buried. Mrs. Lane's lips pressed together. I realized it could not be controlled forever. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Which is why you acted. She moved to the window and looked out into the frost-covered garden. You focused on the letter. You believed it was the danger. But the letter was only a voice. She turned back. These notes are the memory. Major Slate spoke quietly. And memory does not disappear when paper is taken. Miss Marple agreed. No. She returned to the desk and picked up one final slip of paper. This one, she said, is the most important. Dr. Graves leaned closer. Why? Because it records a time that does not match the others, Miss Marple replied. A payment made when no one claims responsibility. Peter Ashford frowned. What does that mean? Miss Marple looked at him gently. It means someone acted alone. The room absorbed that. Mrs. Lane's calm finally faltered. That is impossible. Miss Marple shook her head. It is inevitable. She placed the slip back with the others. The arrangement worked because everyone believed responsibility was shared. But this moment broke that balance. She looked directly at Peter Ashford. You, she said softly, were not supposed to be involved. Peter's face drained of color. That's not true. Miss Marple did not accuse. She simply observed. You were young. You handled details. You moved papers. You were trusted because you seemed harmless. Peter shook his head. I only did what I was told. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. Until the moment you did something no one told you to do. Silence pressed in. Miss Marple continued. That payment was made late. Quietly. Without instruction, it corrected an error that would have exposed everything. Peter's hands trembled. I was trying to help. Miss Marple's voice remained kind. Help often creates the most damage when it hides the truth. Mrs. Hart whispered. The past kept changing. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. Small corrections. Small lies. Until the shape no longer resembled the truth at all, she gathered the slips back into the folder. This is why the letter mattered. It named the act. But this explains the pattern. Mrs. Lane closed her eyes briefly. So the letter was never enough. No, Miss Marple said gently. But it was the beginning. The clock in the study ticked steadily, marking time honestly now. Miss Marple held the folder carefully. This, she said, is what no one thought important enough to destroy. And in that oversight, the truth had waited patiently. They returned downstairs together, quieter now, their steps heavy with understanding. The drawing room greeted them with familiar warmth, but the comfort felt distant, as though it belonged to another evening altogether. The fire crackled softly. The gramophone had fallen silent. Time continued without ceremony. Miss Marple placed the leather folder on the table in the center of the room. She did not open it again. She did not need to. Its presence alone carried weight. Mr. Weatherby sat heavily in his chair. So this was never about one letter. Miss Marple nodded. It was about a pattern. Dr. Graves spoke quietly, and patterns implicate everyone who maintains them. Miss Marple looked at him kindly. Yes. Peter Ashford stood apart, his earlier confidence completely gone. I never meant for this to happen. Miss Marple's voice was calm. Intention is not the same as consequence. Mrs. Hart wiped her eyes. Then what happens now? Miss Marple folded her hands. Now the truth must be allowed to settle. Mrs. Lane sat stiffly. You will expose us. Miss Marple shook her head gently. I will do nothing. The room stilled. I am not a judge, Miss Marple continued. I am merely a witness to patterns. Major Slate nodded. Responsibility cannot be avoided forever. Miss Marple looked at Mrs. Lane. You believed control would protect everyone. Mrs. Lane's voice was low. It protected us for years. Miss Marple met her gaze. At the cost of honesty. Silence followed. Miss Marple continued. The last hour of the year created the illusion of an ending. You believed that if the letter disappeared before midnight, the past would remain in the past. Mr. Weatherby closed his eyes. We were wrong. Yes, Miss Marple said gently, because endings that rely on silence never truly end. She stood and walked slowly toward the mantel. The key still lay there beside the clock. She picked it up and turned it between her fingers. This key, she said softly, opened more than a door. It opened memory. She placed it back down. The truth was never hidden in the study, she continued. It was hidden in routine, in habit, in the way you all agreed not to ask questions. Dr. Graves exhaled slowly. And now, Miss Marple looked at the folder again. Now the truth will move forward. Mrs. Hart spoke quietly. Even if it hurts. Miss Marple nodded. Especially then. She looked around the room one last time. Her gaze gentle but unwavering. The detail no one thought important has done what time could not. It has refused to stay silent. The clock chimed softly, marking another quarter hour. The new year advanced, steady and indifferent, and in Ravenhurst House, the shape of guilt had finally been revealed clearly enough that no one could pretend it was not there. Chapter 7. The truth is spoken, without raising its voice. Morning came to Ravenhurst House without ceremony. The sky lightened gradually, pale winter blue pressing gently against the frosted windows. No one slept deeply. The night had drained them of rest long before exhaustion could claim them. When the first light touched the drawing room, it revealed a house that looked unchanged, yet felt permanently altered. Miss Marple sat where she had sat most of the night, her posture composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had not closed her eyes. She had simply allowed the hours to pass, observing the slow transformation of tension into acceptance. Time, once manipulated, had resumed its honest work. Mr. Weatherby stood by the window, watching the garden emerge from shadow. His shoulders were slumped now, the rigid control that had defined him replaced by quiet defeat. Mrs. Hart sat at the table, her face pale but resolute. Dr. Graves remained near the fire, staring into embers that no longer burned. Peter Ashford sat alone in a corner chair, his youth stripped of its protection. Miss Cora Finch hovered uncertainly, no longer sure where usefulness ended and truth began. Mrs. Judith Lane sat upright, hands folded, her elegance intact, but emptied of purpose. Major Slates stood near the doorway, a steady presence, silent and watchful. Miss Marple spoke softly. "It is time," she said. No one asked what she meant. They all knew. Mr. Weatherby turned slowly. "You are going to read the letter?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No. I am going to let you speak." Silence followed. "You wrote the letter," Miss Marple continued, "but the truth it contains does not belong to ink. It belongs to voices." Mrs. Hart inhaled slowly. "We cannot go on pretending." Miss Marple nodded. "Pretending is far more exhausting than honesty." She turned to Mr. Weatherby. "You were prepared to speak. That matters." Mr. Weatherby closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. "Years ago," he began, his voice low, "we made decisions we believed were necessary. We told ourselves they were temporary." Dr. Graves spoke quietly. "We told ourselves no one was harmed." Mrs. Hart lifted her head. Someone was. Silence pressed in again, but it was a different silence now. It did not resist. It listened. Miss Marple did not interrupt. She did not guide. She simply allowed the truth to unfold in its own measured way. Mr. Weatherby continued. "The arrangement benefited us. It protected reputations. It avoided scandal. And it ruined someone quietly." Peter Ashford's voice shook. "I didn't understand what I was fixing." Miss Marple looked at him kindly. "Most harm is done by those who believe they are helping." Mrs. Judith Lane finally spoke. Her voice was calm, but stripped of polish. "I ensured the story remained intact. I believe that was mercy." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Mercy that demands silence is not mercy." Mrs. Lane nodded, as though accepting a truth she had resisted for years. Miss Marple rose slowly and walked to the table. She placed the leather folder beside the folded letter. "This is the full story," she said softly. "Not one act, not one letter." A pattern sustained by many hands. She looked around the room. "You are not here to be judged. You are here to be honest." Major Slate spoke quietly. "Honesty is long overdue." The words settled. Miss Marple felt the shift then. The room no longer resisted the truth. It had grown tired of hiding it. Mr. Weatherby exhaled deeply. "I will inform the authorities." Mrs. Hart nodded. "And the family who was harmed." Dr. Graves lowered his head. "And correct the records." Peter Ashford whispered. "And accept what comes." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is all truth ever asks." She returned to her chair and sat once more, her role complete. The house felt lighter then, though nothing had been repaired yet. Light entered through the windows, revealing dust motes drifting peacefully. The clock ticked steadily, no longer watched, no longer feared. The last hour of the year had ended, but its work had only just been completed. By midday, the village stirred into life. Smoke rose from chimneys. Footsteps crunched on frost. Ordinary sounds returned to the world outside Ravenhurst House, unaware of the quiet reckoning that had taken place within its walls. Miss Marple stood in the hall, her coat fastened, her gloves folded neatly in her hands. She had stayed long enough. Truth, once spoken, did not require her continued presence. It only required courage from those who remained. Mr. Weatherby accompanied her to the door. He looked older now, as though the night had claimed something he could no longer afford to carry. "I was wrong," he said quietly. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Being wrong is not the same as being lost." Mrs. Hart stepped forward. "Thank you." Miss Marple inclined her head. "You already knew what had to be done." Mrs. Judith Lane stood slightly apart. "You have undone years of careful work." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "I have undone nothing. I have only stopped the pretending." Mrs. Lane closed her eyes briefly. "I thought control was strength." Miss Marple replied softly. "Strength is allowing the truth to survive you." The door opened. Cold air rushed in, sharp and clean. The new year waited outside, indifferent yet honest. Miss Marple paused at the threshold and looked back once more. The house stood quietly behind her, its secrets finally unburdened. "The last hour of the year," she said gently, "is often mistaken for an ending." No one spoke. "It is usually a beginning," she finished. She stepped outside. The door closed behind her with a soft, final sound. Ravenhurst House remained, changed not by damage, but by clarity. Inside, the work of consequence would continue. Records would be corrected. Words would be spoken. Silence would no longer be used as shelter. Time moved forward without pause, and somewhere between the frost and the pale winter sky, Miss Marple walked on, calm and unremarkable, carrying nothing with her except the quiet certainty that truth, when finally allowed to speak, did not need to raise its voice to be heard. The house settled into stillness after Miss Marple's departure. Not the uneasy stillness of secrets held too tightly, but the quieter kind that follows an honest confession. Ravenhurst House remained exactly as it had been built, its walls unchanged, its rooms familiar. Yet something essential had shifted within it. The past no longer pressed from behind locked doors or hidden drawers. It had been acknowledged, and in that acknowledgement, its power had faded. Those who remained understood that the new year would not offer comfort easily. There would be conversations yet to come, records to be corrected, apologies that could not undo what had already been done. Consequences would arrive in ordinary ways, without drama, without spectacle. And that, perhaps, was the truest form of justice. The clock continued to tick, steady and impartial, marking time as it always had. No one watched it now. No one feared it. Time no longer needed to be controlled. Outside, The village moved on. Frost melted slowly beneath a pale sun. Smoke rose from chimneys. Life continued, unaware and unconcerned with the reckoning that had taken place in the final hour of the old year. And that was fitting. For some truths do not demand attention from the world. They ask only to be faced, quietly, by those who tried hardest to avoid them.